What did Europe look like in May 1945? Like a continent clinically dead under an artillery barrage. Final shots ceased. Silence covered deformed wastelands. Cities lay leveled. Infrastructure ceased to exist. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Rail lines melted. State planning yielded total physical destruction. The dictator left behind a divided territory. Millions of bodies rested under concrete rubble. Political command chains dissolved. Total German demographic losses exceeded 8 million people. Numbers are precise: 8 million dead. Military personnel perished. Civilian casualties spiked. This figure surpassed 10% of the pre-war population. Entire generations vanished. Allied bombers dropped 2.5 million tons of explosives. 80% of urban centers vanished. 70% of housing stock disappeared. Civilian shelters offered zero protection. Incendiary devices consumed oxygen. Temperatures inside cellars reached 800 degrees Celsius. Suffocation killed thousands instantly. The Red Army advanced across German territory. Assault was massive. Violence responded to violence. Red Army actions mirrored previous military operations on Soviet soil. Nemmersdorf marked the turning point. Hatred fed on past crimes. Civilian populations absorbed the physical impact. State apparatus collapsed. The military structure dissolved. Civilians paid the demographic price. Empathy vanished entirely. The erosion of human survival reached its peak. Decrees erased basic rights. Opponents became physical targets. Execution rates spiked. Millions of displaced individuals wandered through the ruins. We look back at May 1945. The continent remained broken. Medical logistics failed. Food distribution stopped. Millions starved. The cycle of violence reached its physical conclusion. There was no rapid recovery, only ashes. This landscape of death began forming earlier during the winter retreat. Waterways choked with military debris. Power grids failed. By May 1945, the entire transportation, industrial, and municipal infrastructure of the former German Reich lay in ruins, cutting off all remaining life support for the surviving population. 14.5 million people. Between late 1944 and 1950, this mass of civilians did not just vanish from official records, but initiated a prolonged migration on foot across frozen eastern fields. At 14.6 million, the total number of refugees exceeds the entire modern population of Belgium. The mechanical process of this retreat required families to walk hundreds of kilometers through sub-zero temperatures. Individuals discarded heavy possessions along the roadside as their core temperatures dropped and physical exhaustion set in. Those who fell behind the marching schedule froze in the snow or faced immediate execution by advancing units. The demographic crisis shifted from rural exposure to urban spaces when the Red Army breached the perimeters of Berlin and other major population centers. Within these municipal zones, occupying forces systematically engaged in widespread sexual violence against the remaining female demographic. 2 million victims. For the advancing troops, these actions represented direct retaliation for previous military campaigns on their own soil. For the female population, the resulting psychological trauma superseded the physical destruction of their surrounding municipal environment. The physiological toll of the occupation rapidly degraded the biological survival instincts of the remaining urban inhabitants. Ambient temperatures in the capital remained below freezing, and the static water in the canals turned to ice. Thousands of women actively sought out these freezing waters or barricaded themselves underground to evade the continuous assaults. They chose death in the dark cellars. Who were the soldiers sent to defend the ruins on October 18, 1944? 16-year-old boys and grandfathers. A youth gripped a disposable Panzerfaust. The launcher felt heavy. Basic training took mere hours. These metrics define the newly formed Volkssturm structure. To protect those cellars, a formal civilian mobilization decree pushed untrained militia into the crossfire. They faced advancing heavy Soviet armor directly on foot. Single-use anti-tank gear yielded zero tactical defensive probability. The systemic draft operated with a cold mathematical precision. It consumed the final biological reserves of a failing state. The age of the oldest conscripts was 60 years. To compel untrained conscripts into the trenches, the government needed a tangible threat. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels reviewed the preliminary casualty reports and initiated a psychological operation. Field units documented exactly 26 civilian fatalities. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda intercepted this data, artificially inflating the count to 72. This discrepancy became the primary instrument for indoctrination, driving the production of millions of printed leaflets. The fabricated death toll circulated through every newspaper across the remaining territories. Photographers altered the crime scene documentation to maximize the psychological impact. Civilians were informed that any retreat would replicate this execution pattern in their towns. Post-war analyses separated the manufactured panic from the physical evidence. Declassified archives confirmed the authenticity of the initial 26 bodies. What did the 25th Tank Brigade leave behind at the Angrapa River? 14 executed civilians at a temporary shelter. The source material for these propaganda reports emerged directly from the events of October 21, 1944, near the bridge. This vanguard armored unit secured the crossing. It achieved the first Soviet breakthrough onto sovereign German territory in East Prussia. Combat lasted hours. Then the focus shifted to those who failed to evacuate. At a makeshift shelter, 14 locals hid from the artillery fire. A Soviet officer ordered them dragged outside. Riflemen shot them at close range. Their ages ranged from 8 to 84 years old. That night, Soviet forces withdrew. German infantry advanced back into the sector at dawn. Soldiers moved past ruined structures. They approached the temporary shelter. They documented the physical state of the casualties. Metal nails penetrated the wooden boards of barn doors. The victims' limbs were pinned tightly against the sides of transport vehicles in a crucifixion pose. Forensic inspection later confirmed widespread sexual violence. The tragedy of October 21, 1944, in Nemmersdorf did not ignite from a spontaneous burst of violence, but manifested as a direct consequence of accumulated rage from earlier, turning point events on the Eastern Front. What drove millions of soldiers crossing the border of the Reich? The thirst for revenge for burned cities. Where did the fury that crashed into East Prussia in October 1944 originate? An advance of 600 kilometers in just a few weeks. By October 1944, Soviet infantry stepped onto the soil of East Prussia. Soldiers stared at intact houses with solid roofs and unbroken windows. The rumble of thousands of marching boots vibrated continuously through the dirt roads. Back in their home territories, these men had left behind only scorched timber, mass graves, and leveled foundations. This crossing culminated Operation Bagration, initiated in June 1944. The offensive dismantled Army Group Center, pushing German forces entirely out of Soviet territory. During 2 months, troops marched across more than 600 kilometers of destroyed landscape. The visual contrast of intact towns finalized their psychological state, transforming military duty into a desire for personal retaliation. The command issued directives for territorial capture, but the infantry operated on a need for direct physical retribution. Vanguard units approached the village of Nemmersdorf. Why did the German advance stop? In February 1943, soldiers ran out of ammunition. They ran out of food. This march west stemmed from a logistics disaster. It broke the Wehrmacht a year earlier. Stalingrad consumed the supply chains. The temperature plummeted. Thermometers hit -30. Engine oil froze solid. Transport aircraft dropped insufficient crates. Rations disappeared. Medical supplies vanished. Wounded men froze to death. Frostbite claimed fingers. Gangrene spread fast. Surgeons amputated limbs without anesthetics. Doctors lacked bandages. Logistics failed. Soldiers ate dead draft horses. Then they ate rats. Ice wind blew. It howled through rusted armor husks. Steel skeletons littered the ruined streets. The Sixth Army starved in the rubble. 5 months of combat drained them. Infantrymen chewed boiled leather. Rifle bolts froze shut. Machine guns jammed constantly. Artillery units fired their last shells. Barrels deformed from overuse. Guns fell silent. The encirclement tightened daily. Soviet troops advanced closer. The pocket trapped 300,000 men initially. Winter decimated these numbers. Friedrich Paulus commanded this trapped force. His headquarters lacked basic heating. Radio contact with Berlin degraded. The high command demanded suicide. Paulus calculated the remaining supplies. Caloric intake dropped below survival minimum. Soldiers died from infections. Dysentery spread. Typhus followed. Men collapsed in the snow. They died marching. Trenches became mass graves. February 2, 1943. The defense perimeter shattered. There was no tactical retreat. The pocket shrank. Air evacuation was impossible. Soviet tanks overran the runways. Ammunition depots sat completely empty. Medical stations became frozen morgues. Battalions ceased to exist. No food, no warmth, no escape. Human bodies broke down. Lacking any remaining logistical capacity to sustain combat operations, the entire command structure and all surviving troops of Paulus's group surrendered completely. People collapsed from exhaustion directly onto the snow-covered pavements of the cut-off city. The freezing temperatures that shattered the German forces at Stalingrad merely reflected the winter conditions the command engineered. But here, officers deployed the climate as a deliberate weapon. Before the blockade, Leningrad held a population of roughly 3 million people. German infantry bypassed a direct assault. They severed all supply lines. Shipments stopped completely. Urban residents died gradually in unheated apartments from hypothermia and severe malnutrition. Beyond the city borders, execution squads moved through Eastern Europe. In Kiev and Minsk, occupation authorities ordered local residents to gather at designated transit points. At ravines like Babi Yar, tens of thousands of civilians faced continuous firing squads. Then came the sprawling prisoner of war compounds. Officially, command designated captured soldiers as prisoners of war. In reality, guards confined them in roofless pens beneath the snow. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Captives stood in the open wind without any overhead shelter. Ice formed on their uniforms. Guards distributed no rations. Men huddled together in the freezing mud until their bodies simply gave out. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers froze to death in these enclosures. Guards marched the survivors to underground mines and heavy munitions plants. Prisoners operated the machinery until total physical failure. This demographic clearance required no specialized extermination facilities. Starvation and exposure cleared the occupied territory. The command planned to empty these vast lands to create living space for future German colonization. 900 days of blockade. Who followed right behind the Wehrmacht combat units? Death squads moved in. Their orders were clear. They cleared the territory. While planned starvation killed many, rural zones faced manual clearance. SS troops led the operation. The Einsatzgruppen divided the front. They formed 4 operational sectors, A, B, C, and D. These were not combat soldiers. Towns fell. Filtration started. Squads hunted Communist Party members. They isolated Jewish populations. Victims dug trenches. Mass shootings filled the pits. Rural areas faced scorched earth tactics. German command demanded depopulation. The goal was Lebensraum. Living space required empty land. Villages burned, communities disappeared. Soldiers herded families into wooden warehouses. Troops locked wooden barn doors from the outside. Torches ignited the timber. Machine guns covered the windows. No one escaped. Ash from burned villages settled onto the cold, empty ground. How do you legalize the murder of millions of human beings? You issue an official army directive that explicitly abolishes the military tribunal for political opponents. Death squads were merely preliminary instruments deployed to clear the occupied territories. The true bureaucratic apparatus of mass murder required the full mobilization of the armed forces. Officers read the stamped paper to their troops just hours before the invasion commenced. The directive systematically translated ideological hatred into highly specific technical instructions. Soldiers received explicit authorization to execute suspected communist officials and resistant civilians without any formal trial. This administrative decree transformed an upcoming military campaign into a legalized infrastructure for genocide. On June 22, 1941, the operational phase of the Eastern Plan officially initiated. Operation Barbarossa began in the early morning hours with the low, continuous hum of thousands of tank engines crossing the border. Exactly 3 million German soldiers simultaneously breached the Soviet frontier under the parameters of this new directive. To understand this deployment scale, 3 million men represented a force equivalent to the entire population of Norway during that era. This was structurally designed as a Vernichtungskrieg, a systematic war of annihilation where international laws were methodically stripped away. The boundary separating the conventional battlefield from an industrial slaughterhouse dissolved under the weight of these administrative orders. The outcome was measured directly on the ground. For captured prisoner of war commissars, the number of permitted judicial proceedings was exactly 0. 300,000 Allied troops faced continuous German aviation fire at Dunkirk. France collapsed in exactly 6 weeks. The East campaign relied entirely on the math of these victories. Over 2 million French soldiers mobilized, their command structures shattered. The tactical mechanics debuted on September 1, 1939. Heavy tanks and dive bombers linked directly. Portable field radios synchronized the strikes. Radios clicked. This was Blitzkrieg. Orders moved instantly. Enemy responses lagged. Motorized infantry bypassed strongpoints. Panzer columns advanced 60 kilometers daily. Dive bombers struck targeted coordinates. Stuka dive sirens wailed over the coastline. French lines broke apart. Retreating units converged on the sea. The Dunkirk evacuation commenced in 1940. Soldiers dropped their rifles. They abandoned guns. Men ran. Panic spread. 300,000 Allied soldiers left their heavy weaponry completely abandoned on the Dunkirk beaches. Why start a world war when neighbors surrender territory voluntarily? In 1938, Austria was absorbed through the simple signing of documents. Yet before armored vehicles crossed the Polish border in September 1939, entire regions were seized without a single artillery shot. The diplomatic engineering began years earlier. In 1936, the Rome-Berlin Axis aligned German forces with Italy. Concurrently, military units marched into the demilitarized Rhineland. The Western powers issued no military response. The frontier was secured. This expansion yielded critical strategic assets. The bloodless annexation of Austria added 7 million citizens to the Reich. Borders shifted overnight. Then came 1939. The diplomatic pressure shifted toward Czechoslovakia. The sovereign nation was dismantled through political coercion. This territorial acquisition transferred control of the Skoda manufacturing plants in Pilsen directly to Berlin. The industrial shift changed the balance of power. The Skoda factories were among the largest producers of artillery and armored vehicles in Europe. These assembly lines supplied the Wehrmacht with hundreds of light tanks, later designated as the Panzer 35. The military inventory expanded without a single combat casualty. Diplomatic leverage provided the factories required for the upcoming continental conflict. German troops entered Prague without armed resistance. How do you construct an invasion army under severe international bans? You prioritize secret industrial logistics. Diplomatic conquests demanded substantial military backing. Force requires factories. January 30, 1933. A new political administration seized total power. State mechanics transformed. They targeted the Versailles Treaty. The legal mandate allowed only 100,000 active soldiers. Heavy artillery remained explicitly forbidden. Tanks were banned entirely. Berlin broadcasted official peace. Industry weaponized instead. Engineers assembled submarines behind firmly closed factory doors. Combat aviation advanced rapidly in the shadows. Then came 1935. The mask dropped. Mandatory conscription was legally reinstated. The secret Luftwaffe officially emerged with thousands of combat aircraft. Naval projects escalated immediately. U-boats surfaced openly. The entire state apparatus converted into a massive weapons factory. Bureaucratic decisions drafted future combat zones. The 1935 conscription decree launched an unstoppable logistical sequence that would ultimately position 3 million soldiers on the Soviet border by the morning of June 22, 1941.